We're going to watch the full Politico interview with Donald Trump. It's about 40 something minutes long, roughly 40 minutes long. It's done by another person with the last name Burns, so I'm sure it's a fantastic interview. But there was a lot of sound clips from it that are going viral right now. Some in relation to how he talked about the economy. How do you think the economy is doing? A plus, A plus 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 plus, as well as a lot of commentary on the war in Ukraine. And him talking about Ukraine like not really being much of a democracy right now, and how Ukraine needs to come to the table and make a deal. And it seems to again be once again be a pressure to be a campaign to pressure the Ukrainians, try to get them to come to the table and make a deal. And what's interesting about how he talks about it is at one point he says that they need to have an election. He says they need to have an election. They need to have an election right away, because I think there's a question about whether or not Ukraine even is a democracy anymore. I wanted to play what Zelenskyy said in reaction to that, but also just to give you an idea of the tone of the interview. Here is Donald Trump talking about Ukraine.
Your team has been going back and forth between Putin and Zelenskyy with various drafts of a peace deal. Which country right now is in the stronger negotiating position?
Well, there can be no question about it. It's Russia. It's a much bigger country. It's a war that should have never happened. Frankly, it wouldn't have happened if I were president, and it didn't happen for 4 years. I watched that taking place, and I said, wow, they're going to cause some problems here. And it started, and it could have evolved into World War III, frankly. I think it's probably not going to be happening now. I think if I weren't president, you could have had World War III. I think you would have had a much bigger problem than you have right now. But right now, it's a big problem. It's a big problem for Europe, and they're not handling it well.
And after, saying that he stopped World War III, after saying he would stop the war from happening, period, in 24 hours, the goalposts are being moved. Here's him talking about the election, as I said, and how the elections are not happening, how we could even question if Ukraine is a democracy anymore.
Is it time for Ukraine to hold an election, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. It's been a long time. It hasn't been doing particularly well. Yeah, I think it's time. I think it's an important time to hold an election. They're using war not to hold an election, but I would think the Ukrainian people would, should have that choice, and maybe Zelenskyy would win. I don't know who would win, but they haven't had an election in a long time. They talk about a democracy, but it gets to a point where it's not a democracy anymore.
Now, the long-standing back and forth in response to this question, mind you, it's Russia's the one invading, where the government suppresses the opposition, kills opposition leaders, makes it so that speaking out against invasions like the war in Ukraine is a jailable offense, and suppresses civil society in every imaginable way. That's the country that's invading and taking over territory. So in comparison to that, Ukraine does not need to be a shining gem of liberty and freedom. It has to be a country aspiring, moving in the right direction, and also, of course, striving for its own independence. It doesn't need to share all of our liberal values to want to be its own country, but it is moving in the right direction, generally speaking, and it has been since 1991. And it has made more steps since 2014 as well. Whether it has to come with the public bidding for contracts that has led to less corruption, not no corruption, but less corruption, since a lot of it had more transparency when it comes to the public bidding process, or it has to come with the organizations like NABU that are creating the raids on the homes of the corrupt that are filling up the headlines of Ukrainian society right now. You can say, oh, that corruption, that's terrible. That's true. But before it was, oh, corruption scandal, nothing happens. Right now, you got people fleeing the country, which it would have been great if they didn't get to flee the country, if they faced justice in the country. But the fact that they felt that they had to shows that the independence of these organizations being preserved past 2014 does show it moving in the right direction. And so we could make an argument about wartime, just like Churchill, had suspended elections during wartime. Ukrainian, civil society has agreed until the end of the war for suspended elections. It is already talked about in the Ukrainian constitution. It's talked about by President Zelenskyy very openly, and there doesn't seem to be any major opposition figure that wants to push forward with elections right now, including many of the figures that Trump's team has talked to, and I know that his team has talked to them. And I think it's part of the reason why I questioned yesterday whether or not when he said I talked to Ukrainian leaders and Zelenskyy, whether he was talking about people in Zelensky's inner circle or talking about the opposition, or whether it was left intentionally vague, or if I'm just putting too much thought into it generally. Either way, though, I disagree with all of this conceptually. I disagree with the idea that not having elections during wartime is necessarily makes you not a democracy. I disagree with the idea that Donald Trump, of all people, should be the one pushing this, considering he's the one who didn't want to accept the results of a democratic election in 2020. He's somebody who didn't really care when giving $140 billion to the Saudis. He didn't care about their democratic principles. But here we are. Here's the situation we are. This is the critique that's being made. Whether or not Zelenskyy, irrespective of what Donald Trump should know from his conversations, or at least his team's conversation with the opposition, is questioning whether he's a democracy in order to put pressure on his administration. Zelenskyy responded, though. And Zelenskyy's response, I'm going to read it in full, because I think this is Zelenskyy essentially giving Donald Trump a lot of blowback. And the blowback is, I'm going to call your bluff. I want to say that it did not discuss the issue during the meetings in Europe. Secondly, the election question in Ukraine primarily depends on our people. This is a matter for Ukrainians, not people of other countries. With all due respect to our partners, I'll say frankly that I'm ready for elections. If anybody suggests we're clinging to power or I'm personally holding on to the presidency and that's why the war continues, that's completely absurd. To hold elections, there are two issues. First of all, security, how to conduct this, how to do it under attacks, under missile strikes. Then regarding the military, the question of how they'll vote. You know this, and I won't repeat it. You're not going to be able to deliver ballots to everybody in the trenches by drone. Not a viable system. And the second issue, the legislative basis for the legitimacy of holding elections. And since the issue is being raised today by the President of the United States, our partners, I'll answer very briefly. Look, I'm ready for elections. Moreover, I'm asking now and stating openly, I need the United States of America to help me. Together with European colleagues, we can ensure security for conducting elections. And then for the next 60 to 90 days, Ukraine will be ready to hold elections. I personally have the will and readiness for this. And since we have such a situation, I asked our parliamentarians to prepare legislative proposals regarding possible changes to the legal framework and election law during martial law. They will prepare this for me, and I'll be in Ukraine tomorrow. Also, I want and expect proposals from partners, expect proposals from our deputies, and I'm ready to proceed with elections. Now, the standard has been we're not going to have elections during wartime because we want to make sure everybody, including those in occupied territories, those displaced refugees, those in the trenches fighting for, the country's future, have a say in the country's future. There was not only a question of how you would conduct the election, but how you would also conduct it safely. This response, not to mention the constitutionality of it, because there's already a question about whether or not, you conduct the presidential election during wartime, but the parliamentarian election is also under a different framework. You can check out Article 83 of the Ukrainian Constitution if you want to read more. Point is that they would have to do a lot of, at the very least, if they were to do this, they would have to do a lot of legislative reform, in order to have any election take place, any election whatsoever. But Zelenskyy essentially called Trump's bluff, saying, look, if you provide an environment in which I can conduct an election, then I will conduct an election, and I can do it within 3 months. That's a pretty big statement. And if what he said about telling, legislative deputies to prepare proposals in order to make it so that they could have a process, a framework to work upon, to put it through the Ukrainian parliament, the Rada, to put it through the system so that they can actually go through with the legalizing the reforms so that they can actually have that election, and that this is not just chatter. then it's going to be very interesting to see what they do to amend the Constitution to make this possible. It's also going to be very interesting to see how they conduct it and if they're going to be able to get a frontline ceasefire in order to conduct it with soldiers coming back from the front to vote, or they expect soldiers to vote on rotation, or they expect to get the ballots back literally from the front line, or how they really expect to do this seriously. 3 months is, as noted by some people in chat, somewhat fast. Some might even call it unrealistic. But if this is a bluff, then it might not matter whatsoever. That's not to say that Zelenskyy couldn't do it in 3 months. It'd be very difficult, maybe not impossible. It could be very dangerous. It will depend upon if a real full ceasefire could be done. I think if there was a full ceasefire for a month or so, they could do it. The Ukrainians have been able to pull off many other miracles. I think an election in a month is something that might be difficult, but not impossible. But I don't think this conversation might even be necessary right now until we know that the Russians would play seriously with this. As in, okay, we're not going to missile strike this election. We're not going to interfere. We're going to let it be conducted. Because immediately after Zelenskyy responded with this, the Russians responded. This is from a Russian diplomat who works at the foreign ministry, Rodeo Morshinik. Zelensky's statement about his readiness to hold elections is an arrogant bluff and a manipulation of the rules. He is setting deliberately unacceptable conditions for their conduct. Deliberately unacceptable conditions for their conduct. When he says unacceptable conditions for their conduct, is he saying, oh my God, 3 months is too fast to hold an elections? Like, as if the Russians care about, like, the elections need 5 to 6 months to properly take place, considering the fraud nonsense that they did in occupied territory. But I do think that for them, asking for missile protections on certain days, or asking for, a ceasefire for a period so the soldiers could vote, stuff like that, the security guarantees that an election would be based in, that is to them unacceptable. Which then brings me back to the conclusion of Russia, once again, wants territory like the Donbass to be given up to them without the security guarantees necessary to allow the Ukrainians to dig in further, both with European and American support and just to hold on, just in both themselves physically. Part of the reason why they still entertain troop caps. By the way, the Russians really did love that interview Trump gave.
He's a great salesman. I call him P.T. Barnum. You know who P.T. Barnum was, right?
I do.
One of the greatest on earth. He could sell any product at any time. That was his expression. I can sell any product at any time. It was true. He said, doesn't matter whether it works or not. But he's P.T. Barnum. He got crooked Joe Biden to give him $350 billion. And look what it got. It got him about 25% of his country is missing.
How awful. Number one, it wasn't $350 billion. This is a continuous number he just throws out. That's not true. It's closer to 150 billion. So we're talking about about half of that number, which is quite a substantial lie. But with those funds given over a 4-year time period, and a lot of it much after it would have been most effective. Even though, if they could have gotten this earlier on before 2023, who knows how the war could have been different. But the idea that, he got all that aid and they still lost 25% of the country. 25% of the country. Currently, the Russians occupied 20% of the country. Is Trump already considering another 5% just gone? Let me just negotiate away another 5%. Northern Donetsk, you just give that away. Maybe actually Kherson, that's how it's going to go. Or how about we just talk about this area, this area, this area. He's already negotiating more territory away in his head, 25%. He just added an extra 5% of territory over to the Russians. But as if column A led to column B, some might say that the fact that it's in the 20s, it's either 20%, 25%, either or, is in part due to the fact that they did resist.
Burns is
when the Russians,
immoral,
remember at the start of the war,
morally
marching on
corrupt,
Kiev. The
bankrupt
fact that we're
man.
talking about an 800,000 troop cap for the Ukrainian armed forces, when at the start of the war, the Russians were seeking 150,000.
A curd is a curd.
Quite a substantial difference.
Many thanks. Dylan, you are awesome.
Hey, a CHF 100. I don't know what that means, DD World for you. What is what is that currency system?